I just want to say one more thing about Dan. Dan is a graduate of Wisconsin with civil engineering and engineering mechanics, but he spent most of his time, I think, hanging out with Harvey Littleton,
right,
playing around with glass before he moved to Portland, Oregon, and set up Bullseye Glass with Ray Algren, Boyce Lundstrom, which was pretty much just, I think, an old trashed out house, a furnace, and
a dog,
a steel table, a bunch of hand rollers, and a dog. And a dog. Did you say and a dog? Before Lani McGregor came along.
Replace the dog.
So, guys, welcome, and artists in the factory.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jess. Is this working? Okay, fabulous. And thank you for that fabulous party last night, too. That was a pretty great way to start a conference. And thank you, Ausglass, for inviting us. Although I have to admit, I wasn't actually invited. Dan was invited. And Dan doesn't do these things because he's too busy running the company, the factory. And the other guy that could possibly touch on the area that we wanted to cover is Sam, and he also is too busy. We calculated last night that Sam, in his 27 years at Bullseye, has actually formulated, melted, and scheduled 90,000 separate batches of glass. I don't know what we're doing while you're gone, but because these guys have so little time, what I said we would do here is that I would put together a few images on the theme of artists that we've worked with and how they have impacted our factory in Portland, Oregon, and then I just asked these guys some questions about what that was about. So that's how we're going to run this. We're going to cover actually 3 artists in a little bit of depth, not very much. The first one, of course, is going to be Klaus Moye. The second is going to be Klaus's student, Richard Whiteley. And the third is going to be, you're going to get yours too, Jess. Yes. And then other artists that have also been through the factory, but in a much more cursory sort of way. And I apologize to everybody in Australia that we are not covering because this is the most remarkable community of glass artists, and what you have done for our factory in terms of inspiration and bringing us technical challenges is really unparalleled in the world. So because you've always been so wonderful to us, and you have such an incredible respect for Sam and his great abilities, I'd like to show you how that respect and reverence is oops, I'm sorry, I should have been on this screen the whole time. How that respect and reverence is manifested out there in the public. We don't let Sam out of the factory very often because this is what happens to him. He goes up to Pilchuck to have some artists. And tell me what the heck was going on here, Sam.
Well, this was a session up at Pilchuck where I was given the privilege and tasked with the task of facilitating the melting and assisting in the kiln forming of glasses, where Rudy and Lino were exploring the combination of mixed kiln
forming,
yeah. And this session was actually inspired by a connection show that happened, as I remember, about a year earlier, where Klaus had produced a body of work with Dante Marioni, if I remember right.
So all of these things sort of flow out of each other.
That's
and
right.
Some of the things that you're not seeing that really have flown out of these are a student in the class here at Pilchuck was here in the audience somewhere, yes. Kirsty. And it's out of this session, I believe, that Kirsty then went on to put together the remarkable programs of latitudes here twice in Australia that traveled the world. Dan is usually treated a little better by the artists, or maybe that it's just that we let him hang out with the more gentlemanly artists. And this, as Sam alluded to, was the year before the project at Pilchuck. And what's going on here? you two kids?
Well, Dante came down to Portland, actually with Klaus, to do this series of Moye Marioni works, and generously provided the gaffing skills to actually make these works. So in this case, it was not us being tortured by an artist as much as us torturing Dante and making him do the gaffing of all of these roll-ups, and then later kind of forcing him to do a whole, I think it was 10 years that we had him come down to the factory and blow glass, making these Venetian cups, sort of almost as entertainment for the Portland people, because we don't have much of a blowing community in Portland. So we tortured him as much as possible.
But it actually was also key to formulating, because every year we would, for 10 years, we would challenge arguably the best glass blower in the United States with the person we considered the best glass formulator, and between them they would come up with a range of colors and of blowing glasses, which we never released to the public.
Well, but some of the colors, of course, that we did do there, I have to admit, there was a white in particular, I remember, that was a launching point for a white that we introduced later, which really was the result of that session with Dante.
Yeah. But leaping back from Artists in the Factory to how the factory actually started. And the artists who thought that this was just going to be a day job until they got famous. They'd gone to school with Chihuly and they thought they were going to. But tell me, Dan, whatever possessed you?
Well, I didn't
and
have
who was
enough
dressing
time
you?
to zip up my fly, obviously, but both Ray and I were graduates actually under Harvey Littleton in the glass program there in Madison in the late 60s, and moved out to Portland to set up a glass blowing facility, and brought Ray out. And we'd go to art fairs with our works, and this was, a time where there weren't galleries. There was really no venues to selling the glass work. Habitat, Heller, galleries like that hadn't even existed. So we went to these art fairs trying to sell the work, but we kept running into people doing stained glass and said, hey, we can't find any glass. So we said, hey, perfect opportunity, start a glass factory to make sheet glass. Obviously, if we can blow glass, we can certainly make sheet glass. And then we'll do it until we each have $100,000, and we'll go back to blowing glass. Well, I'm still waiting for that 100,000, but
in the meantime,
why we started.
In the meantime, you did consider yourselves the artists in the factory.
We felt very confident. As you can see, we were doing some pretty funky work, but we thought it was actually quite exquisitely made. You can see the upper right. To us, this is a well-formed vase. Right?
This would have been,
in 1980, the Mountain Blue, so we had an opportunity to make a Mount St. Helens ash dish. But this was actually well before Kugler rods were introduced into the glass scene. So we were actually making our own color at that time, and that was sort of a driver for us. But we still thought we were artists.
About 5 years after you had started the factory, you ran across an artist in Pilchuck, or actually Boyce, your partner, ran into Klaus Moye, and this really was the first serious artist to impact the company in a number of ways. And what I've done is, with these three artists, sort of listed the issues that they brought to us and challenged us with. But it was more than just the technical challenges. It was the real inspiration that artists working to this level brought to us as a factory. The first and critical issue has always been compatibility of glass. And I'm going to turn this, Dan, to talk about what was it. You were already looking at compatibility prior to even meeting Klaus, and you were going down some strange paths, right?
Yeah, well, we were making glass, as I was saying, for stained glass, and mixing a lot of transparent colors with opals, and there was one color in particular that kept breaking. So we looked at it and said, well, it's obviously the coefficient of expansion. We sent the two glasses off to Corning Engineering Services, which was running a lab at the time, and came back that the opal white was indeed about 4 points lower than the transparent. So we said, okay, we'll fix that. We changed the chemistry of the opal and got the expansion to match it. And lo and behold, the problem got substantially worse. The stuff just broke coming right out of the layer. So what's really going on here? Obviously, matching glasses is not about the coefficient of expansion, it must be about something else. So what is that? So we started out by drawing threads, the typical thing that the glass blowers were doing at the time, but we reasoned that that wasn't working because you were getting glass out of a furnace, taking it, pulling it into these threads, bringing it down to room temperature in literally minutes, where in a kiln, this happens over, you know, many hours, and you also have much, much larger quantities of glass that are interfaced together. So we tried other tests, the bar test, and finally, someone who was working for us, a physicist actually from Madison, Wisconsin, Bob Barber, who said, just do a chip. Just take a chip of the color you want to test and put it on the clear glass, fuse it together and look at it under a polarimeter, and if there's strain, then you know it doesn't fit. And you change the chemistry until it fits. And if you match all of the colored glasses to clear, then they should all fit each other. So that's what you see on the top there is the chip test. Below is the instrument called a dilatometer, which actually measures the coefficient of expansion of glass. But what it does significantly more than that. It takes a glass sample and takes it up through its softening point.
That's what we're looking at here, right? The chart of that process.
And that's where the essence of compatibility really happens, is in the range, what's called the viscoelastic range. If you look at the graph, you can see you have a very straight line at the lower end. That's the coefficient of expansion range, measured somewhere between room temperature and 300 degrees. And that's always very linear. Then you go through this viscoelastic range and then up into the plastic range. But it's really in that range where things have to be right in order to be compatible. And in particular, there's a point called the transformation point, TG. And that's what we really stumble on. If we make that fit there, then it all works. I mean, literally, you can be 10 expansion points off, and the glasses will still fit, because you're talking parts per million. You know, a 90 expansion is 90 parts per million. So if you're off by 10, that's 10 parts per million. That's not going to break a piece, right, in ambient conditions. But if it didn't get done right in that transformation region, it's not going to work.
So at this point, you think you've pretty much figured out compatibility, and you think that Klaus is going to be happy and go away.
Yep.
No. He comes back with this. And what was this about?
Yeah, you know, again, I think what we love, you know, prior to coming to here, of course, we had developed a lot of additional colors. We're putting it through the standard chip test. Klaus, of course, pushes the envelope again, as we love artists do, pushes the envelope and brings us a new problem. Basically, what he had done is he had subjected the glass to extremes of time and temperature, which changed the chemistry of some of the glasses. This really caused us to rethink what we were doing, working with people like Rudy Gritch, Dan, myself, developed an additional suite of tests that we came up with to really put the glass through its paces, to understand what was going on. As the result of analyzing the glasses through that suite of tests, of course, we realized some glasses needed to be modified. So then back to the drawing board, we reviewed the chemistry of those glasses, modified the chemistry of those glasses, and then put it through those tests. What we see at the top here is what we call the triple fire test, where basically we're taking a chip of glass, as we did in the chip test, but we're subjecting it to multiple heat history, so that we're firing it, well, in the case of this, 3 times at a set temperature, at a set rate, holding it at a set amount of time, and then again viewing it through the polarimeter to determine if there's a mismatch due to strain.
Right, so now you've solved compatibility, you've solved multiple high temperature firings, and you think that Klaus is going to be happy again. Instead, what does he do? He goes big, which is what everybody seems to be doing nowadays. And what was this, Sam?
Yeah, again, we pushing the envelope. This constant dialogue between the factory and the artist always doing things you never expected somebody would do, and they take things into a new realm. So here we see these enormous panels. There were 8 individuals here who basically fabricated these panels over a period of, I believe, about 600 man-hours, cutting over 22,000 individual pieces of glass that they assembled first into 100 basically substrates of glass that were then cut apart again, reassembled, and fused into these large panels that we see here.
Right.
The other thing, let me just mention, of course, since he scaled up, and Dan had been doing this, fortunately, prior to these panels, we started becoming aware of where this was going. And so Dan, of course, analyzed the annealing that was necessary, the equipment changes that were necessary, the change in thermocouple positions and the amount of thermocouples, so we could really analyze what was happening in the kiln so we could successfully produce a body of work like this and have them be stable.
Right. So now you've got well annealed panels weighing each about 200 pounds and really newsworthy, museum worthy. And they go to museums and they travel around the country in museums. And they will actually be going to their permanent final home at the Corning Museum of Glass new wing, opening in March. But prior to that, they had gone to a number of museums. And Dan, what is your greatest fear when work like this goes to a museum?
Falling off the wall, right? And which is not an uncommon phenomena. So what we did to assure ourselves that it was going to stay on the wall was to test the glue. First of all, we researched and found that the Corning, Dow Corning 995 glue was probably the best for this application. So we set up a glue test where we were gluing these stainless steel French cleats to the back of the piece. So we took a square inch of glue joint and set up this test that you see on the right, put a bucket and kept pouring sand in it until we got to 50 times the load that glue joint was going to need to carry the load of holding this piece to the wall. The other thing we made sure is that there was redundancy. So there were two sets of these cleats so that if one did fail, the other one would carry the load. But we ended up adding enough sand, as I said, to be 50 times what it needed to be. And we came up with that based on the fact that most engineers use a safety factor of 5 when they're building a building. If a beam needs to carry so much weight, they make sure it can carry 5 times that. We said we wanted to have it 10 times greater than what they would want it, so hence 50. And they held up so far.
So bottom line at the end of the Klaus saga, and it's not the end of the saga yet, but he hasn't tortured us completely. He's also given us some real reassurance, and something that I think that he said to Dan some years ago, Dan keeps coming back with and feeling relieved about.
We were in San Francisco and having Klaus and myself and Lonnie having dinner or lunch with our distributor down there, and he asked Klaus, well, what should Bullseye be making for new colors for artists? And Klaus, to his credit, said, they don't need to make any more colors. The artists need to just take the palette and use it in creative ways to make more colors by overlays, etc. So that was kind of refreshing because he didn't want anything. He just said, the job's done.
And then to make up for that, he produced some students who came with their own set of problems.
And a cup of coffee.
And a cup of coffee. And this is leaping forward about two decades after Klaus. Although we're continuing to work with Klaus, but really we first encountered Richard Whiteley as a graduate student in 1989 at the Australian Kiln Form Glass Show in Los Angeles, and at that time he wasn't doing casting, and we weren't doing casting. We were not making glasses for casting, but when he went on that journey, he dragged us along with this whole set of issues. And Sam is going to, maybe you can tell us what's going on here. And if you forget anything, I think Mel will be able to fill you in because that's the back of Mel.
As I remember this was, we were fortunate to bring together in the factory a group of world-class kiln casters here, Richard Whiteley, Clifford Rainey, Janusz Valentinovich, Karen Lamont, Galia Amsel, and I believe Bill Carlson were all in that group. And they came together really to discuss and analyze what they all knew about kiln casting and share ideas and critique and again, push the envelope. So what we see here, of course, is they're loading the kilns. But what we see on the table was, at the time we were producing, and we did have a very limited palette of glasses for kiln casting, but the colors were really dark, and they had come from the sheet glass, really, and they were made for much smaller scale work. And what we were doing at the time was pouring out ingots basically on a marver table as large air-cooled pies and allowing them to free break. The problem with that, of course, is it becomes very difficult to assess the quality control of that. So I think really under Richard's advice and stuff, we rethought what we were doing, changed the process, built new equipment, and produced the ingots in a format where they could be annealed and then viewed through a polarimeter so we could look at the internal, if there's any internal strain or any internal inclusions. So we took this, of course, to that new format.
And that new format should have been enough, but it wasn't. You wanted more. And what you wanted specifically, which everyone wants if you're casting and you're casting thick, is light tints. And we didn't have light tints because we were a glass factory rolling sheet glass, primarily in 1/8" thicknesses for the stained glass trade originally and then for kiln forming. So what is it about light tints that is so hellish, Sam?
Well, let's see. Technically, we have to reduce the amount of metallic oxides we're using that produce the color in the glass. In the case of a lot of the tints that we do, we've reduced them down so low that now we have to worry about the trace metallic oxides, predominantly iron oxide, that's coming along in the raw materials. In the case of a number of the colors we were doing for Richard, the trace iron oxide could be 10 to 100-fold greater than the colorants we now were attempting to introduce into the glass. So we had to then reassess the raw materials we were using and bring in much purer raw materials and stuff that were devoid of this iron. The other thing, of course, we had to do is make sure that the mixing vessels and the furnaces themselves, we were very conscious of keeping everything clean and conscious of the flow of color to color so we didn't cross-contaminate the colors we were producing with something that we produced previous to that. And that challenge goes on every day.
And so once you've changed the format of your material and you've developed new lighter tints, it is again back in the hands of the artist. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And when it works, it is absolutely stunning. And when it doesn't work, thank you for sharing. But it is a dialogue, and it's a fabulous dialogue, and it has kept us so energized at the factory. And sometimes it works to the point of something that you could name Afterglow. I love this this combination of glasses that are compatible and artists who know what they're doing. We found a lot of those in Australia. The other thing we found in Australia that I'm going to leap to now is a range of neutrals. I don't know what it is about this country, but you seem to love the range between clear white and black. And at least the artists that we've interacted with have brought both aesthetic inspiration and some real challenges. Of the neutralists, I think the queen of the
neutrality
is in fact Jess Lachlan, who has, for all her peaceable sort of quiet work, brings some of the most challenging issues. Some of those aren't normally things that we would be working on, and so the first one, which I would call an impossible form, is one that just showed up at SOFA 2004 with, I think, and has in the last 10 years gotten the nerve to pass it on to other people, I guess. And the last week. So, those of you who were in Jess's class this last week, I don't know if you know the history of how challenging this form was, but when we saw it for the first time there, Dan, what was...
well, Jess had told us, I think she'd made almost 18 of these to get successful one. And it was such a spectacular piece that I said, Jess, let's come to the factory if you can. And I got a hold of Ray Algren, our ex-partner, to sit down and see if we couldn't help her be more successful at making the piece. And it wasn't that she was doing anything wrong. It was, I mean, basically in the end, it really got down to that she needed a kiln that had bottom elements, and that because in order to anneal something this complex, I mean, there were problems with the core mold inside that needed proper channel vents and needed to be pre-fired. And she basically ended up wrapping the piece literally in fiber board vermiculite board, I think. But it was the fact that she had pushed the envelope so far that her kiln could no longer do the job. She was no longer annealing 6 millimeters or 2 layers of 6 millimeter sheet. This piece was 50 millimeters thick. So she needed bottom elements in her kiln. And I believe she went home and revamped her kiln and has been quite successful with these pieces ever since. So again, it was not that the artist didn't know what they were doing. It was usually that they pushed it so far that it exceeds either the material or the equipment they have to work with.
You know, to go back to the color range, though, in these whites, Sam, how many whites do we have, and why do we have so many whites?
I think we've somewhere between 8 and 13 different whites that vary from extremely translucent to extremely opaque and everything in between. And the reason we have them really is because we are tasked by the artist, who each has their own unique aesthetic and want to use that material in a slightly different way. And so we find ourselves over the years producing a pretty wide spectrum of whites.
And the genesis of this particular white?
This is a white that, as I remember, Jess was using, and the genesis of this particular white was, let's see, it was a formula that Lino had given me that was an Italian formula for an opaque white. We modified the formula to make it compatible with our line, took this to Pilchuck for a body of work there that was part of a full bull session. Lino was using this, Dick Marcus. Dick brought me the glass back with an additional problem, reformulated the glass again, and Jess started using this glass in a completely different, unique way, again, pushing the envelope. She took this glass, ground this glass to a very fine dust, mixed it with a vehicle, flooded the surface, was able to evaporate it, and produce this beautiful gradation, this ethereal white from nothing to completely opaque.
And just...
Okay.
So now we know that the trick of working with artists is keeping things locked up. Okay. Well, we have ways to get back at you, and this is one of the ways that Dan wants to get back at you, because we've always felt that Jess had a particular affinity for a way of working with kiln glass that isn't done very much, but it's a favorite of Dan's.
Yeah, just the minimalness of it, to me, just lends itself to architectural applications. So we did a show in Chicago where we wanted to really push the envelope and ask the artist to make larger works. And in this case, I think this piece is about 8 feet long.
I think so.
Or longer. She just needed a bigger kiln, so we brought her to Portland, and she created this wonderful minimal piece that we fired in a kiln that we knew would both handle it but anneal it as well.
Which gave you an excuse for more big equipment.
Yeah, we got to build something to, when it weighs 300 pounds, it's a little hard to hoist it out of the kiln. So again, just adapting what the major glass industry uses, some vacuum cups that attaches to a rigging to a forklift, and we can hoist the piece out.
Oh, we're going to leave Klaus, Richard, and Jess here and move quickly through just a few other artists that we've worked with who have, again, pushed this neutral palette. Sam, you want to talk a little bit more about Chick and Kobe? And Kobe especially in terms of, well, either one in terms of this exhibition that we mounted at the end of 2013 at our gallery in Portland, and the floor panels, which are Chick's, that white one. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the challenge of that particular.
Yeah. Of whites in general. I mean, the challenge is really just that it's white. So any inclusion, any blemish and stuff shows up. So we have to be very fastidious, both in the batching of it, what glass it followed, of course, so the white stays pure, it isn't subtly tinted. We have to make sure that we pay attention to the forming process, of course, so that we don't develop an inclusion or a blemish on the surface that might come from a tool or something it comes into contact with while it's hot or cold, quite frankly. So that challenge also is a daily challenge that we face with those 13 whites that we do.
And we were just at Chick and Kobe's, and something that I heard you and Chick talking about that I hadn't realized before, and that's that as much as we can encourage artists to watch all of our glass, excuse me, is very well documented. It has numbers, it has dates, but if you're putting two glasses together, it's not enough just to look at the date of the production on a glass that has tolerances like, or demands like white. What was the situation here?
Well, what they were doing was using a large substrate of white, and as I was explaining to him, you know, the main opacifying agent that we use in most of our whites, though not all, is fluorine, and that changes throughout the melt, and so it could be subtly denser at the top of the melt and subtly a little less dense at the bottom of the melt. And so what he realized, by his own ingenuity, of course, is how to set up that kiln and that body of work so that he could put the white below but encapsulate the top with sheets of white that he knew were next to each other, and then by a very clever slow firing cycle allow that upper substrate to move very slowly and not to roll or bring the glass up from underneath, and produce this surface basically that where everything was invisible as the sheets butted against each other.
And sometimes when that invisibility of white becomes too intense, the artist then has to actually inject just a tiny hint of color in order to keep that distinction of the whites. In the case of this set of Kobe's, I'm actually so thrilled that these even show up on the screen because they are. In fact, this one has actually been heightened by Photoshop, the contrast, because it doesn't look that contrasty in real life. And your response to this particular work, or one of these, when we saw it in Miami, was...
It was amazing on the wall. As I stood back from it, I couldn't... It seemed to blend together, but it coaxed me forward. And as I got closer and closer to it, all of a sudden I realized the depth of this as the separation of these whites and stuff became apparent. And the piece, prior to this, I thought that was amazing and clever, her ability to separate those whites by looking at the palette of a transparent gray, and by varying the intensity and the thickness of that amount of gray, she was able to create those really subtle gradations from the lightest gray to separate that white down to the center where it was a little darker, and again off to that ethereal white.
So on either end of the spectrum here, though, we're looking at the most problematic glasses being the whites and then the blacks. And black is just a hell of a glass to melt and to make. You want to talk about some of the trauma of black?
Let's see. For us, this particular black is like the polar opposite of the light casting tints that we do, in that here we're super saturating the glass with metallic oxides. It essentially is really a transparent color that is so saturated it appears to be opaque and appears to read more as an opal. The problem with that, of course, in melting it is that you can't really see into the glass, and so we really have to pay attention to the age of the furnace that we put it in, analyze the quality of the melt. We'll do things like examine it in a thin substrate and make sure that it's internally is clean. And then, of course, the problem now is that you're dealing with a surface, and that's all you're dealing with. You're looking at that surface after you formed it. So we have to be very careful that the surface is devoid of any entrained air or any inclusion that will cause that surface to blemish.
And given that glass is such a problematic, black is such a problematic glass, it was with some horror that I asked an Australian artist at SOFA a few months ago if we could do anything in glass for you, what would it be? And she snickers here in the audience. She said, make all your glasses like black, because black glasses, the seam when you butt them together and fire them doesn't show. So I went home and told Sam that, and he's going to come get Mel Douglas.
No, again, we love this ongoing dialogue. We push the envelope, the artist pushes the envelope, this dialogue goes back and forth, we share information with each other as we write this chapter of kiln forming that's never been written before. I find it exciting. Some of the challenges are, of course, more challenging than others. In the case of this, Dan and I have had some conversations about it to understand really what's going on there. And it may be that when we have the cut line and we look at the microfine bubbles that are produced by the cut line, that there may be a way to be able to go through the chemistry, forming process, and more importantly, which we discover so many times, the genius of the kiln former themselves to solve their own problems, that they may be able to help us solve that problem as well. And we can share this information with each other.
So as we move up into right up to the present, I would like to immediately before coming to 2014, 2015, go back 17 years and just give a nod to one of the most remarkable projects we ever did. It was the first time we brought 4 artists into the factory. This was 1997, and the impact that this group, they didn't bring problems to us really. What they brought to us was an awareness that there was a community of artists in this part of the world who had such skills, such education, such vision, that we should maybe watching them more than listening or thinking of ourselves solely as technicians. And one of the things that it really set us on a course to doing was exhibitions. If it had not been for this group in 1997, who were the first, who we first took to SOFA, first time ever, bringing a group of artists, and actually it was the beginning of our even starting a gallery.
And one of the most successful SOFAs we've ever had.
Well, yeah, it was. Thank you, Giles. I think we sold 28 pieces in 3 days or something. It was delusional. We thought it would be so easy after that. 17 years later, the next group of young Aussies came into the factory, and this was in December, just about 2 months ago, and we're there for about 5 weeks. And during that time, we came to, it was a very, very short time to see what they would do, but we learned some significant things. One of which was, Dan, you want to?
Yeah, from Lee, it was just inspiring to see that she was able to do these really delicate forms in a light soda-lime glass like ours. I mean, typically people assume you need a dense lead glass to be able to do that, but through the proper venting and spruing and having the right reservoir, she showed me that no, you can do it. So it was quite uplifting.
What did we learn from this?
Yeah, I was requested here to make our thin glass even thinner, which we may yet do. But of course, during the residency there, rather than wait for me, this artist pushed the envelope themselves and figured out a way to be able to take these transparent colors and make them even thinner by essentially, I believe, putting them in the kiln and weighting them down with a kiln shelf and basically squishing the glass to even a thinner substrate and able to overlay them and get these beautiful gradations. Yeah, inspirational for me.
And speaking of gradations, gradations,
yeah.
You like that pun?
Yes. Could you please make the billets bigger? So we would have a much larger, basically, piece of glass that we could fill this cavity with. So again, we'll review, look at the equipment, redesign, reanalyze how we could go about doing that, and produce this glass in a larger format to facilitate the work of somebody, once again, taking us to a new place.
And if she keeps making that tiramisu and sending it our way, I think we will, right?
Oh, this work. All 4 of these artists and stuff were so inspirational. The drawings that were up on the wall as I came through, when I looked at these drawings, at first I saw them as well architectural as cityscapes, but then I realized, at least what I got out of this, it was all about light and shadow. And when I think of light and shadow, I think of black and white, and so personally, this sent me on a journey myself to produce a series of grays that I'm in the process of doing and that we're melting even as I'm here, of being able to go from crystal clear to black and from white to black. So I'll have a range of opal grays and a range of transparent grays. And I did, the other night, I had this epiphany and did a little quick math and realized that in producing a range of both of these with a technique, of course, that the artists have taught me, by overlaying these colors, I'll now have 64 individual shades of gray that I'll be able to produce. So I'm really excited to see where we go with this.
And to wind up here, our last image, ironically, we capped the end of 2014 and the beginning of 2014 with a former graduate of the Australian National University, whose name happened to be Anu, who came to us from Finland, where she is now, many years later, working as an independent designer for Itala Marimekko, but also in her own studio using our glass in ways that I think, Sam, you were very, very fulfilled by, because it brought back that that comment by Klaus.
Yeah. Here I'm being educated. She produced a whole range of colors, many of which I looked at that she had done, and I looked at how she got there, and I realized I could not do that with the chemistry. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't produce those colors. She produced these sumptuous violets and these muted tones that we see that are in the kind of the ochre family there. And I was really inspired to see her ability to take an existing palette and produce these colors that we don't have. And frankly, many of which I'm embarrassed to say, I don't know if I could even make. So this was exciting to see this partnership again of an artist educating me, quite frankly.
And Sam, the reason we probably couldn't make those is because by overlaying them, you can get two colors together that you couldn't make in a melt in the furnace, because the oxides would react.
That's right, and produce a completely different color and spoil it. That's right.
So that's the end of our few minutes here. And if you're wondering what that little group is in the up corner, well, these guys are developing glasses. I'm developing new artists, and
we're making our own Australians.
We've gotten rather heavily into children's programming in glass. These are some 5-year-olds that came through the factory during Anu's residency, and they have the freshest minds like all artists ought to have, and ideally do. And so thank you all for putting up with us. I just wanted to say we're right at the end of our time here. It might be time for one question, but otherwise, and I know everybody much prefers to catch people in the hallways rather than in big spaces like this. These guys are here. Don't ask me any questions. I don't know anything. These guys are here for the next 2.5 days, and I hope you will corner them and ask them any questions you have about.
Yeah, great.
Great.
Exciting. Time for a couple.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Hiker.
It's the viscosity in that viscoelastic range. And the only way...
Sorry. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If the COE so is not the main issue with compatibility. What is the main issue?
It's not the only thing to consider.
Yeah, it's really the viscosity of the glass through that viscoelastic range. Because, for instance, I know we also tried another thing with Corning. We asked them to send them their standard for 90 CEO glass, and they sent us a glass, and we tested it, and it just broke right out of the test thing, because it was a lead glass. It had a very different viscosity, but it's in that viscoelastic range, and the only way you can really test that is with a test similar to that chip test, because that truly is a piece of the pie. In other words, it's taking it through the whole process, and ideally, if you're doing a casting like you are, where it may be in there for several days going through its heat cycle, then you really want to even take that chip through that heat cycle as well, because again, it's in that range that you have to match it. In hindsight, I was foolish enough to write a book and mention the COE and said, it should be within plus or minus 5. I regret ever publishing that because it really is misleading. People think, oh, one CEO will fit the other. It's fine if you've all got the same base glass, and the problem again happens as soon as you add color to it, you've changed the composition.
Internally, what we do when we look at that glass, it's much tighter standards than that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Within
the factory, much tighter. Yeah.
I think that's something that nobody talks about is what the range when you have glasses that match in compatibility. What is the range? Because it's never about exactly dead on. You have to have a range there.
We talked about that initial single chip test that we do, and we do this with everything every day, early in the melt, all the way through the melt, all the way through the forming process. And with the polarimeter, we also have what we call a retardation lens, which is essentially a 360 degrees. And we have set tight standards where we examine the glass under compression and the glass under expansion. So we look at the glass where it's low, we look at the glass where it's high, and we tell ourselves that we won't allow more than 2 degrees retardation from where it's 0 is where we saw the chip where we see the strain in all 4 corners. And what I do is I rotate this device to get the strain to extinguish in 2 of the corners and grow in the other 2. Where I see it extinguish, I see a number there, and I affix that number. And I won't allow more than 2 low or more than 4 high. That's an extremely tight standard. The individuals who read that every day, it's amazing what the eye can do, but they can tell less than 1/3 of a degree expansion for 200 pounds of glass that I would have to change. I mean, it's incredibly tight.
Judith.
You mean when we pass away? Is that what you're... No.
That's not funny.
It's a good question, Judith. And,
It's where to next?
Cloning?
Yeah.
No. Yeah, it's a good question.
No, we do have at least something in place. You know, I'm 72. I figure I'm good for another 20 years, right? We do have our main staff of people, of which Sam is one, will carry on after us, and Sam's training somebody under him, and likewise throughout the company, we're making sure that there are people being trained under us. I mean, the biggest thing we want to do is transfer information and knowledge, not only to the general public, but within our own organization, to make sure there are people to...
Yeah. What do they say? You learn, you do, you teach. And we've got a great family and a great group of people there, and people, fortunately, much younger than me, who are in many cases brighter than I am even. I mean, this is my opinion. So I love working with those people. I love knowing that the furnace has never gone out from ancient times to now. And so the challenge is to keep the furnace going. And that's our dream, I think, is to keep that furnace going and give that information away. And we've got capable people there. Yeah.
One more question. Mel, George.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So how artists influence the different types of forms of glass you make, and what's the next form?
Maybe not to share too much because it drives the sales department crazy, quite frankly. But
I'm sure you guys drive the sales department crazy all the time.
Yeah. Yes. But even when I met with Chick recently, he asked me just a simple question: could I make the sheet of thin longer and supply that? Because he had a body of work that he wanted to do where he just wanted a longer, thin sheet. So there's a format and stuff, something that we already do. When we cut them up now, they'll be a little more precarious to pack and ship. But I think certainly in some quantity, we certainly can do that and maybe make him the beta tester for that sort of thing. And so that's just, I think, just one example. The example of trying to make a larger ingot of glass that's annealed for kiln forming and stuff. I think this is something else we could investigate.
Well, after seeing the photonics lab, I'd love to start extruding things and doing, I mean, we pull stringer, obviously.
And rod.
But there's just a lot of potential right there by making preforms and then drawing those or stretching those into a spinner that way. But you guys are going to...
Yeah, you have to tell us.
What would you want?
Uh-huh.
Facebook. That's so true.
Is there something you're hoping for? Well, I guess I'm trying to be more specific. Like, and what is that? Oh, you're talking about a glass that will self-destruct. Is this what you're going to ask me about?
That's the rumor.
This is something Lani asked me a couple years ago. Could you make a glass basically that would slowly, methodically self-destruct, hopefully in a safe way, so that we could have glass not necessarily be something that's permanent, but something that could be more transitory. So there's another challenge. So I think that would be an interesting thing to do. Again, I think it would drive the sales department crazy,
Well,
but I guess
it because it's going to deteriorate and keep selling more glass, right? So
yeah.
Well, now you've talked yourself into a real corner there, Sam. You're not getting out of the factory until you've got some self-destructing glass.
Well,
Thanks, Mal.
I think a while ago, no. Was it what you were referring to? No. Well, what? Oh, okay.
That old thing.
Yeah.
We actually have.
Yeah.
You just can't afford to buy it.
Oh. Yeah.
No, it's a challenge. It's a challenge, but it's one we're working on. And look at this. We're right on.
Yeah, I would like to say thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. And I do look forward to those new forms of glass, especially the fine powder, because that cuts my process in half.
Great.